Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today we're going to look at whether ultimate Kars, or just regular Kars, and actually in this particular instance, is faster than light. Is Kars faster than light? So the reason why I'm doing this is because someone had disagreed on my video of Kars versus Cell, saying that Kars would obviously win because Kars is FTL, he's faster than light. And I was linked to this calc on the Naruto forums, but it's archived on Wayback Machine, probably because it's not on the forums anymore. But anyway, let's take a look. So JJBA Kars' reaction / short distance movement speed. In Part 2 Battle Tendency, Stroheim fires an ultraviolet light beam at Kars, who manages to move his hand to attempt to block it before it hits him. As I believe I was the one to originally bring this feat to the attention of the OBD, I figure I might as well be the one to calc it. So here we see the page from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, where Stroheim opens up his eye. Well, it's not really an eye anymore that much, but he opens it up, and Kars sees it, and then he activates his ultraviolet beam, and here's the calc showing pixel distance. Of course, very frequently used. Now, of course, I would say that in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, particularly early on, the scale of the characters and the proportions do actually change quite a bit, as well as the fact that perspective is sometimes used in very interesting ways in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, that characters may be closer than they appear, or they may be farther than they appear. But anyway, I'm going to take this at face value, though, and assume that this is exactly as is measured out. So see, he then manages to block it with his hand, even though his hand was not actually both his hands, by the looks of it, even though his hands were not right up, as you can see in this panel. His hands aren't right here, so his hands must have moved relatively fast to block the attack. Because if the light beam is already this far away, then his hands would theoretically have to move FTL to block it. But here we go. I couldn't find any info on Kars' height, but he is a superhuman monster and pretty tall guy. So the body proportion articles, and the beam getting pixel distance. But ultimately, I'm going to assume that the math is all done correctly. I'm not going to double check this. Ultimately, we get a speed that is very high, where hand movement speed, a minimum of more than 9.5 times the speed of light, using high end, of course assuming C is a constant here. Using the high-end low distance, his speed would be almost 42 times C, which is very fast. And of course there's comments here, but I don't really see... okay, here we go. We already get the problems here. Now, I consider this to be an accurate analysis of this page, of what is exactly happening on this page. I consider the analysis made by the user here, Endless Mike, to be accurate, in that it accurately makes a calculation based on what Araki put on the page. But I would say that this is an outlier. Now, you may ask, why is this an outlier? Well, there are 3 reasons why I'm going to say that it is an outlier. But first, let me define why I can say that this is an outlier. Because in power scaling, there is importance to have consistency in the power scaling, so that it makes sense when you say a character is faster than another, or is slower than another, or can catch up to another or not. You need consistency in your power scaling, so that you don't always scale characters based on necessarily the highest feat, if that feat would make the character inconsistent in his speed. And I believe that this is an instance, and I've got 3 reasons why I believe that this should not be taken as the normative or even the correct speed, because this is not a reason, but I'm just getting into this. In a lot of manga tropes, you have a situation where artists don't necessarily know all of the ins and outs of how physics work, so they might not necessarily implement it accurately in their stories, and I believe that this is an instance of that. But anyway, the first reason is because Kars, whether in pre-Ultimate or Ultimate, has never otherwise been shown to move that fast, at least consistently, in the sense that, as a commenter had mentioned, he was not catching up to a plane, an ordinary airplane, moving very fast from the 1930s. And additionally, I would say that if he were indeed able to move and react FTL, he wouldn't have gotten hit by the rocks, even though he was indeed distracted. I don't believe that he would have gotten hit by them, because if he were able to actually think that fast, then he would have been able to dodge them. Additionally, I would say that otherwise his movement and attack speeds have never been shown to be that fast. But that actually brings us into the second point. Scaling him to other characters speed-wise also indicates that he is probably not that fast. Now, why might I say that? Well, the reason is, for example, he ends up fighting Joseph Joestar quite frequently towards the end of the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, and Joseph Joestar over here is definitely not FTL. And we have no indication that he is FTL, or that any other characters that fight Kars are FTL, besides, of course, when they're firing an actual beam of ultraviolet light, which is obviously at least C, of course, accounting for it passing through the fluid medium of the air at 1 or less atmospheres, usually. So, just some extra calculation there, that the light there isn't actually moving at exactly C, because it's moving through a fluid medium, so it's probably not moving at exactly C, however, probably very close to it. But anyway, so none of the other characters are shown to be that fast, and nor is the airplane that Kars followed. So finally, the third reason is that, physically speaking, Kars isn't shown to be tough enough to withstand movements at such speed, or to physically be capable of moving at such speeds. Now, you may ask, is he blocking the beam itself, or is he blocking the aim of the beam? Now, the commenter on my video that commented implied that he was blocking the beam itself rather than the aim of that beam, and therefore blocking the beam. However, I contend that this is impossible, at least not within the scope of the powers that we know that Kars has, or even Ultimate Kars. Now, why might I say that? Because in order to see a beam of light and react to it, you need one of two things. And the first is you need a sensory system that uses tachyons, because tachyons, of course, being hypothetical particles that move faster than light. But the reason I say this is because obviously he can't hear the light move or feel vibrations from it, because the light is moving faster than the speed of sound. And he isn't going to be able to catch it by some sort of animalistic magnetic field, because what's actually traveling him is the light is an electromagnetic wave, so detecting it through a magnetic field before it hits is not very likely. And when it concerns sight, the only way you can see light is if it hits you in the eyes. In other words, the light that is traveling towards him is invisible to him until it actually hits him in the eyes, which means that he can't actually see it in this panel. He would not be able to see it physically with his eyes. Now, I know a lot of manga authors don't actually do the physics that way, and they pretend like, theoretically, if you're faster than light, that you could detect things faster than light, which, if we're assuming physics here work the same, you wouldn't be able to unless you have either tachyons or some sort of spiritual way of detecting physical things that are happening that is instantaneous or faster than light. Neither of which Kars seems to have. At least there's no evidence that he has any of that, and he's never been shown to have any of that. But moving more onto the limitations of it, also, even if he were to have those, he would also have to have the ability to think through tachyons or faster than light spiritual things, because the electrochemical processes by which thoughts are conveyed are a lot slower than light, which means that even if he were to react to it at such a short distance, he wouldn't be able to react fast enough. So ultimately, it is beyond the limitations that are known from biology. And I'm even being generous by including tachyons, which we don't really know whether that would even work. But I'm just being generous here, using some science fiction. Now, additionally, moving his hand at c, or even 9 times c, or even 41 times c, would create an enormous amount of friction. And if it creates such an enormous amount of friction with the air, the speed, of course, would probably melt his hand. Now, you might ask, how would I know that it would melt his hand? Well, because, okay, the reason why I believe it would melt his hand is because Kars, in his ultimate form, which is more powerful than what we're seeing in these panels, is shown to be weaker, all right, than lava. His flesh would not withstand direct contact with lava, which is why he has to exude bubbles that then cause a rock shell to form around his body so that he doesn't get burned up when he falls into a volcano. And as one might know, the speed at which an object moves through a medium, the higher it becomes, the more friction it occurs between that object and the surrounding medium through which it is moving. Now, a big example would be, for example, let's say a space shuttle. As it comes down, it creates an enormous amount of heat as it collides with the air. Now, with the speed of the movement that the calc implies, he is moving many, many times faster than that. Many, many times faster. So much so that one scientist once told me that if you were to collide an object at the speed of light, it would have an explosion equivalent to the antimatter amount that object would equate to. So what I'm essentially saying is it would cause a very big boom, one that Kars would not survive, knowing his physical limitations. Now, that citation regarding a scientist, I'm willing to say that that's probably not accurate. It's probably more a roundabout saying. But I do believe that colliding things at high speeds causes an enormous amount of heat and potentially even explosions. So I do not believe that Kars would be able to survive moving at the speed of light, judging by his toughness. Now you might say, well, what does this have to do with Cell then? Well, here's the exact problem. With Imperfect Cell, who was the type of cell that I was using in the video, Imperfect Cell was theoretically more powerful than Piccolo when Piccolo destroyed the moon in Dragon Ball. Now, it is worth noting that Piccolo's destruction of the moon emitted a large amount of light. However, there wasn't any visible debris left over. It was as if it had been vaporized or annihilated. Perhaps not annihilated, because that has different implications physically, but it was destroyed completely, is what I'm saying. Now, this is after, of course, in the story-wise, Piccolo later on is a lot weaker than Raditz, and then there's a training arc where later on he is up against the Saiyans with Vegeta in the Saiyan Saga, and Piccolo is a lot weaker than those. So there's a lot of growth happening between when he destroyed the moon and when he's fighting Imperfect Cell. So much growth, in fact, that we then end up with the Namek Saga, and Piccolo ends up keeping up with Frieza in one of his transformations, which is interesting to note because Frieza casually, in his ultra-suppressed base form, was able to destroy a planet. So ultimately, you get into the amount of heat that would generate, and you compare that to the amount of heat that Kars can withstand, and it would be ludicrous to assume that Kars would be able to withstand a ki blast from Imperfect Cell. It would be ludicrous to assume that he would be able to withstand that, because his toughness simply isn't at that level, and this speed feat is absolutely an outlier because it's inconsistent with the character's other speed showings, it's inconsistent with the speed that the character is fighting, and it's inconsistent with the known limitations of the character. Therefore, it's an outlier. But that's my opinion. Tell me what you think. Do you think that this is a legit stat? A legit feat? Do you think that I'm wrong? If there's some particular reason that I'm still wrong, that I still haven't mentioned something that should be mentioned, is there something that I completely missed? I would be happy to hear it. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.